So my presentation might be a little bit different from some of the other presentations you've seen, sir, in Open Data Week. This isn't a research project. It's not a data analytics project. This is really much more of like a narrative story about an application that's been around for 18 years plus. I'm going to talk really fast. I'm going to show lots and lots of slides. Please don't worry about taking notes or copying down links. I'm going to put the whole presentation in GitHub and you'll have access to the presentation later. So I'm also just going to do a lot of talking. Zachary is nice enough to check on the chat, but I won't be responding to the chat. And I'm hoping to get through everything kind of quickly. I've got lots of slides and lots to talk about, but I hope that we have plenty of time to do some discussions at the end. I put the questions for the discussion at the end in the beginning so that you can think about what you want to talk about. And really, it involves kind of your impressions or experiences with Citymap over the years. Just to give you a little agenda, I'm going to talk about myself. I'll talk about OTI and Doit, and some people may not be familiar with that as an organization. I'll explain who Esri is. And then I really want to talk about this application called Citymap or NiceMap or NY Citymap. These are all the same thing. It's been around for so long that it's got multiple names, right? Where it comes from, heyday, some challenges, its redesign and recent redeployment. But the meat of the presentation is going to be, what did people think of Citymap? So in August, we posted a survey. We've got 1,500 respondents from responses from people who use Citymap and give really passionate and in-depth information about how they use this app. And I think that was kind of special. And hopefully people will take away from this, ideas for apps or data or maps that the community in New York City in general sort of needs. So just to start off, my name is Tim Calabrese. I use he and pronouns. I'm a project manager in Esri's professional services division. So I'll make software, I manage projects, and lots of other smart people implement the technology to produce solutions, right? Before that, I worked at Department of City Planning and Department of Education and School Bus Office. And before that, I was in Plunter College Geography Department. So I talked about what a project manager is. I mean, a project manager is not super technical, and I like lots of context, and I think in terms of stories most of the time. This is my voice. There's some important voices that are missing from the conversation, particularly from Doit and from OTI. I invited them to participate, with the exception of Mario Bovea, an early programmer and developer there. They chose not to participate, which is great. It's understandable. I hope to do them their work justice in this presentation. So if you're not familiar, you're going to hear me kind of oscillate between two terminologies for the same department. The Department of Information Technology and Telecommunications, known as Doit, is the organization that the government team that built Citymap back in 2006 and maintained it for years. In 2022, Doit was consolidated with a bunch of other important offices, including Mayor's Office of Data Analytics, into a larger technology office called Office of Technology and Innovation. So you're probably going to hear me, I might use both terms, but in this case, they're equivalent. Doit and OTI are going to be equivalent terms here. And what does OTI do for New York City? Well, they deliver pretty much all of the city's IT services, right? The hardware, software, technical support, right? They manage all the software contracts. They facilitate citywide data sharing and information. Certainly, like as Zachary said, open data is a big part of OTI. They regulate the telecommunication services and the cable franchises and all kinds of stuff. So there's tons of street artifacts or street furniture that's out there that's, whether it's 5G or other equipment, that's all kind of managed through the OTI offices. So really important organization that facilitates all kinds of things in the city. So this is a super oversimplified diagram, and I'm only focusing in, and I only display it this way because I want to kind of focus in on sort of the GIS offerings, right? But OTI includes 311 and 911 and Cyber Command that that protects us from cyber attacks, and then all of these technical services, and GIS is one of those. The GIS team really focuses on kind of three main sort of deliverables. They make applications, and you've probably seen most of these applications like Hurricane Evacuation Zone Finder, or the Then and Now app that had the aerial imagery that you could look through, right? Street closures or city map. They also create and maintain super important data sets, CSCL, the building footprints, the orthophotography that is run every couple of years, the planimetric layers that are derived from the ortho photos, all super important GIS data sets. And they produce GIS map services that can be consumed in applications. So base maps, so you don't have to create base maps from scratch, and geocoding services through GeoClient. Super important stuff. OTI, like a lot of city agencies, though, has been challenged after the pandemic with staffing, losing headcount, and that's an important backdrop to kind of some of the challenges that go into maintaining super important data sets, applications, and services to the city. There's this incredible, with people leaving, it creates a harder environment to complete work, right? So the GIS unit has been without a director since 2018. They did have one for a short time, but in 2022, that was great. And the GIS team, while much smaller than it was, they still have to produce all of this data and all of these services, right? And this idea of this shrinking pool of resources at OTI, causes challenges. You might think that, this is like a consultant's feast, right? There's no workers, so the consultants come in and sweep in and do all kinds of work. This is an excerpt from an article that was in Slate, mostly about subway costs, but I think there was a really salient point that was made, that was in here, that the loss of the staff at OTI makes it really hard for consultants to do their job because there aren't enough informed decision makers to make good decisions about how to move forward. So this is one of the challenges that we're having in the context of how we've worked with OTI, and I'll explain a little bit more about that coming up. I want to talk about the company that I work for. It's called Esri. We make popular GIS software that's used in lots of governments and organizations around the world. We're considered a big company, and maybe people have interfaced with the product, or maybe you've met some of the salespeople, but I thought it might be worthwhile to just kind of explain that, like, there's the product or the software developers, there's the salespeople who sell the product, and then there's consulting services who are consultants that help customers implement the product in their environment. But the important thing is that there's a relationship between the sales and the services group back to the product and back forth. So we bring information to the team of people who make the software, and then they improve the software based on the feedback that we provide to them. Of course, they take feedback from customers as well, but there's an important relationship between all of these that are constantly improving the product. Again, I'll mention why that's important in just a couple of slides. I provided at the bottom just a short, very basic overview of the partial timeline of Esri. Esri is a 50-year-old software company, right? So it extends, the arrow extends to the left pretty far. But there's some really important technology shifts that occurred between 2004 and 2010 that impact how Esri and the relationship to Citymap really worked out. So in 2004, Esri product called ArcGIS Server just starts to come out, and then Esri starts to move from object relational software to service-oriented architecture that makes use of services. And I think you saw me mention before, OTI producing map services, and this is when there's a very large change and shift in the way that systems are architected. So taking a step back in time, Citymap launches around 2006. It is, there's, articles in the paper, there's ribbon cuttings. I wasn't there, so I can't speak to it exactly, but this is an early version of the version of Citymap that was released at that time. I did work for the city when it came out, so I do remember. I remember using it when it came out and everybody being excited about it. And when it was originally built in 2006, this is information that I got from Mario Gouveia, who was there and do it at the time. It was using ArcGIS, so an early ArcGIS server version predating the ArcGIS server. And it was to great fanfare in 2006. Around that same time, Esri advised DoIT at that time to switch their technology base from ArcGIS to ArcGIS server. And DoIT took that advice from us as a software company doing consultation. That migration was not successful. And DoIT, developers at DoIT were able to rebuild that Citymap using an open source stack, GeoServer, open layers. And they were able to do it in a very quick time. I can say that organizationally inside of Esri, here we are, this big company, but this migration failure was a seminal moment in our company. It's still taught as a instructive moment about not rushing to production, software that's not ready to be able to handle it. It was really significant because I mentioned this Mario Gouveia, who is one of the solution architects for the original Citymap. He presented this architecture at Esri's user conference in 2006. So this was a big deal for Esri in New York to have this showcase in New York, and to lose it to an unsuccessful migration was like I said, it was a big point. DoIT rebuild Citymap on GeoServer and open layers, and Citymap is a huge success, continues to be a huge success there. Throughout 2010 to through 2018, the developers at DoIT continue to develop Citymap and make it grow. There is the WordPress blog about Citymap that's still up. It's kind of an interesting artifact. I mean, organizationally, right, it probably is an interesting case that you've got a blog to an app that doesn't look like this app anymore, right, that's been replatformed. But when you go through the blog, I invite people to go through the blog. There is tons of information. Just if you're a geography nerd like me, there's just tons of geographic facts, details about the data. Some of those data sets are still in use. It's just an incredibly loving and attentive document to sort of give, to wrap a lot of context around Citymap in a way that I feel like a lot of applications don't get the attention to. So invite people to check it out. If you're not familiar with Citymap, maybe you got here too late, or you were doing GIS in a different realm and you never used Citymap. This was an application that's designed to build tons and tons of functionality, really like a map portal type of kitchen sink app that just has so much in it. You can search by all kinds of different geographic conditions that are all related and tied directly to the city's geocoding services like GeoSupport. So on, from, to, and intersection and council districts and so on. All kinds of information about those search locations. So information that's coming from Map Pluto or building information, all the authoritative city sources displaying that information about specific sites. You can overlay all kinds of additional data on top of, in terms of like a series of map layers. They had a function for collecting feedback about that data. It's the ability to swap base maps, and not just simple base maps, but also the various aerial images from various years in 96, 1951, 1924, all kinds of stuff. And then of course, kind of the ability to pan, zoom, measure, send emails. And this is kind of it's so much functionality that it's not the kind of thing that you can get on one snapshot, right? So there's the data feedback, the search locations, there's additional data. You may not be able to see it very well on the screen, but when you get your hands on a presentation, you'll be able to kind of zoom in and see a little bit more of it. And over 100 data layers that were you were able to toggle on. And for many people, again, take you back to 2006, this predates open data. This might have been one of the first open data viewers that city residents would have. This is the first time that they might be able to like interact with various different data layers and be able to make these visual representations themselves. So a super important application, but as you can imagine, there's a lot of challenges that come up with maintaining all of this data. How do you maintain the provenance of all these data sets, right? Starting in 2018 and 2019, there starts to become some challenges with CityMap, right? It doesn't load on some browsers. Some people, this might be the last vision or the last view of CityMap that you have seen. Building a property information not being updated, aerial imagery not being updated, so on and so forth. Some of the challenges that maybe people saw in other mapping interfaces that CityMap didn't allow was the ability to view data in a tabular format or the ability to download data, right? And with those challenges, there's also this kind of idea of a shift in the design principles, right? So for a long time through the 2010s, sort of people starting to realize that maybe showcase apps or kitchen sink apps aren't the best design choice, right? So this is the idea of Hicks' law, right? So if you give a lot of choices, it makes it harder to make a decision, not easier, right? So the idea that there's a much more focus in creating single purpose map apps that allow give people much more concise information faster. And so there's a shift away from the map portals like CityMap, but there's still people who like CityMap. They still use it, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. In 2021, OTI, because DoIT becomes OTI, and OTI contracts with Esri to undertake a project called NextGen GIS, right? Which is a 2-year project, replatform the GIS over at OTI. There's physical infrastructure that is at the end of their warranty, it's end of life. They want to retire some of that physical infrastructure, migrate geospatial data into the cloud. The decision is made for that to be Esri and Microsoft Azure. They want to follow this cloud first principle. So we want to make apps that are residing in the cloud, deliver these geospatial services similar to the ones that were being served by DoIT for quite some time, and facilitate data sharing with city departments, right? The last one is also key, developing a capability to rapidly deploy apps by using what we call commercial off-the-shelf app builders. So the idea that you may not be a front-end developer developing in JavaScript code from scratch, you may be using a cloud-based tool that allows you to drag and drop widgets that create the app. The idea being that it can be a little bit faster and a little bit lower barrier to entry by using these apps. We call them CUTs apps. And if you've seen other presentations throughout Open Data Week, you would have seen some of these described as Experience Builder or Survey 123 or Instant Apps in some of the other GIS presentations. So don't worry, I'm not going to talk about this, but our project was big, right? We did a lot of things on this project to replatform data locators, cartographic resources, to build repositories for data and for GIS information, and then to replatform a number of these apps. In some cases, we had music cuts, a custom template, but in many cases, we were able to use a cuts framework. While we were working on this project, the decision was made to migrate CityMap away from being a custom app and use the CUTs framework. And that was an important decision because it constrained some of the capabilities part of the trade-off with a COTS app builder is you lose some of the incredible customization that you can put into a custom app. But the decision was made that that would be a better use of our time and budget and schedule, right? So Citymap gets reborn as a COTS app, and I'll explain a little bit more about what that means. So in January, well, I should say, in the spring of 2022, we rebuild Citymap, and we look at the legacy Citymap and try to pick out the most salient features and functionality that's in it, and create in the context of our app framework, our COTS app framework, the functionality that we can produce in that way, right? So, and it's key to know that we built the app before we asked for feedback, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. Probably not the best way to do it, but in the constraints of the way that the project was running, that's how it kind of got done. As an overall framework for what Citymap is, there's a bunch of data sources like DOB buildings, city planning's facility database, CSCL from OTI, MapLudo, and other sources that get sucked into a extract, transform, and load toolkit called FME. This brings data in, it puts it up in the cloud. In Esri speak, our instance of the cloud, you may be familiar with Microsoft's version of the cloud, which is Azure, or Amazon's AWS, right? For Esri, we call that cloud instance ArcGIS Online. We abbreviate it AGOL, right? And then every customer who is part of that cloud partitions out their portion of the cloud. We call it an organization. And OTI named their organization NYC Maps. Okay. So we take the data from these disparate sources, we put it up in NYC Maps, and from there we can create web maps. And in those, and we insert those web maps into these app builder frameworks. One is Experience Builder, the other is called Instant Apps. And we use those COTS app builders to build the front end for Citymap, a portion of it called Map Explorer, which I'll show in a second, and another portion called Lot Info. And this is a screenshot of the Lot Info part of Citymap. You can see the two tabs over at the top, Lot Info and Map Explorer. You can think of them as kind of like two separate apps that are embedded into a single app. Lot Info is gives users the ability to search all kinds of locations, to get all kinds of property information. It has links to other city sources like Appriss or Zola. It gives information about other geographies so that you can find out for any location what police precinct it's in, what community district it's in, what school district it's in, so on and so forth, and the ability to swap out base maps. So some of the functionality that was in the original Citymap, but it doesn't have the map layers. We have the second part of Citymap, which is the Map Explorer, which allows people to toggle on and off all kinds of different map layers. It allows people to find nearest features by using the Nearby tool, right? And it also allows people to, if you click on a layer, right-click, you'll be able to export that data in those formats, JSON, CSV, or GeoJSON. We have built another interface other than Citymap that we would like. It's available to city employees, people who have an Active Directory email address that's city-owned, that they can access these data sets, but the kind of Esrified or other the data formats that are consumable directly in Esri format for software. So as I kind of mentioned in terms of timeline, we designed Citymap in the spring of 2022. In August of 2022, did I say the wrong thing? 2023. Sorry about that. I gave it the wrong year. Pardon me. It was ready to be released in August of 2023, and the chief analytics officer, Martha Noor, had some very wise feedback and said, "Hey, you should really ask users what they're using Citymap for to make sure that you have the right functionality in it before you launch it, right? You don't want to take one thing away and give something else and then find out that you were missing something important." We had already built the application and our contract was at an end, so there wasn't schedule and budget to do a lot of changes, but we thought it was still really important to do a survey to find out the results and how people were working on it. And that's what I'll focus in on next. So August 15th, we put a page in front of the legacy Citymap and said, "Hey, changes are coming. Would you mind filling out this survey and let us know how you use this application?" And you can see, like, by September 5th, about a half a month later, we got nearly 800 responses. Talking with other project managers over at OTI who have released apps from OTI in the past, they've never seen this many responses to surveys about OTI apps before. So they were pretty impressed. And I'm going to go through a lot of the results from this survey. You're going to see lots and lots of word clouds. Now, I know analytically, word clouds are not always the best representation of data. They miss a ton of context. They value, counts instead of importance so I'm not trying to say that word clouds are the best analytical tool here, but I think in this case, they offer, context for discussion about the questions that we ask. So we ask people, well, what do you do for work? And I think you can see, there's a lot going on in the real estate business and engineering and architecture. I think the other one that clearly just jumps out is retired, right? Did not expect that as a result, and it was pretty neat. We asked people if they've ever used Citymap, and a lot of people use it very often, right? We asked them what kind of projects they work on, mostly work projects, not exclusively. We wanted to get a sense of if our users were working for the city of New York, right? So when Citymap launched in 2006, there weren't a lot of GIS resources in other agencies. They were certainly there. I was working as a GIS tech in a city agency at that time. But there may have been city workers who were using Citymap to support a business process that they worked on that maybe their agency could support internally. So we wanted to get a little bit more information about whether or not they worked for the city of New York, and there was a fair amount. These numbers are not too large. Department of Transportation had represented 38 people responded to the survey from DOT. There were 26 responses from the FDNY, 22 responses from HPD. So these numbers are not huge, but we thought it was still meaningful and important that that we could potentially influence or impact city work processes. We asked them to describe how they use it, and building information was the largest, was the most prominent use case for Citymap. Lots of people using it to find property and building information. And then I will allude to this, I think, again, a little bit later, but in August of 2023 and September of 2023, the Department of Finance city tax map was probably as old as the original Citymap. I mean, it's one of the original big GIS applications that had been designed many, many years ago. And it was undergoing, the public didn't know this, but it was undergoing a huge overhaul and replatforming itself. That application, now called Property Information Portal, which is amazing and fantastic, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, wasn't released until January of 2024. So when people were responding to the survey, they didn't know that property information portal was going to come out and have a lot of this information in a new way, displayed in the new way. We wanted to ask people about how they search for that information. This was to validate that, yes, a lot of it is about building and property information. We asked if they search by address or if they search in other ways. You see that intersections and block and lot and building ID numbers are really important. This is key because in the current city map, this is functionality that we want to add into it. So currently in the city map that's released now, 2.0, right, you can search by address, borough, block, lot, and building ID number. We've built a series of locators based on CSCL that will allow geocoding for intersections and on-from too, but we haven't released those yet. And that's kind of internal to OTI that there's still some testing that needs to be done in the environment that it's being hosted in. Or we may leverage GeoHive, which is, a product that OTI has maintained for a really long time. It is a great product for doing that kind of geocoding. But it's not functionality that's there now. So it's something that we hope to build to. We asked them about what additional data they like to throw on the map, but it seems like schools and community centers are the most prominent ones. Do they look at boundaries on the map? So we're kind of focusing in on all those data layers that are over there on that left-hand side. Which ones do they click on and off the most? Community districts being the largest. So schools and community districts will be two data sets that people like to add to that map when they're using it. When they use the nearest facility capability, it's not a super heavily used capability, but when they do, they want to see where schools, police stations, fire, public safety locations are. Functionality for the legacy city map allows you to actually create a map and then send a link to that view of that map. Very cool. It wasn't functionality that people used a ton, but it was still important and a very cool capability. People do seem to print it a little bit more than sending a link, though, in terms of like the total number of responses. And then we asked people if they measure distances between the 2 points. I think those are two things that are really, I'll speak to the results of that. So we wanted to see that people like to see how New York changed. So one of the really cool functions of Legacy City Map was that it had the aerial photos from various years going back in the past. And we learned, I think too late, that we learned that wasn't a really important and well-loved function that we would like to add back to it. I'll talk a little bit more about that before. Again, kind of going in, this is the last question that we asked in this way about functionality that wasn't listed. And we're talking about property and building. And, they didn't know that property information portal was coming. We asked them about other kinds of information that they'd be interested in. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into this, into these results in just a second. We also asked, do you wish you could do something? So kind of like forward thinking, asking people to think into the future a little bit about capabilities that they haven't received yet. Before I show sort of a summary and an analysis of those future looking questions, I just wanted to relate about how passionate some of these responses really were. You had, teachers, lawyers, retirees, community advocates, civil servants, all using CityMap to solve problems in their own way. And it was, when we looked back at it, many people would have asked, well, who was CityMap designed for? Single purpose apps are a little bit simpler. You can kind of think of one scenario, design the app to create an information, to give information about that one scenario. CityMap is a little bit different. And so we weren't sure how people were using it. We're curious if it had ever been designed for all of these different use cases, but to see teachers using it to help teach kids about the history of New York City, or, reading about lawyers who use it to research cases for their constituents, right? The just really neat responses that people spend a ton of time filling in. But to take some of that feedback and digest it and put it into categories, we saw that there were 6 major categories of things. And number one, in first modes, people talked about just reliability, working on all the browsers. I think that was kind of their, for many people at that time in September of 2023, their last experience was it not working on this browser or that browser. Since we've relaunched it, it works on all the browsers, but we do know that some people would have some trouble using the export function on Map Explorer. And in all the cases that we've researched, it has to do with their pop-up blockers keeping that. So if you do use it, want to export, just keep in mind that you may need to disable a pop-up blocker, depending on your browser. Respondents were very interested in geocoding and search. We want to be able, in the current city map, to replicate all of those, including intersections and a very special one, which is called on from to, which is like, I'm on this street between this street and this street, which in New York sounds like really normal, but for geocoding software, that's a problem that it needs to solve that's a little bit different. That is something that we're working on and it's currently in advanced development over at OTI right now. Additional layers that people wanted to see. One of the things that we found is that people really like to see the subway lines, but they want to see the subway lines the way they appear on the MTA subway map. Meaning, like if you're in Queens, they don't want to see the F line and the E line over the top of each other. They need to see those separated, and they need an orange line and a blue line, even if they're in the same space, right? They have to be separate, right? And so I think that's something that we need to work on and be able to add. Reaching out to, love to work with the MTA to get like the best visualization for that. DOT protected streets apparently was something that was available that is now missing, but is still available through the DOT on the DOT website. Sewer mains, water mains, and MTA bus routes. Again, a hard thing to display on a map because they're different at different times of the day, right? So they're big challenges, but they would be super important. People would like to see new visualizations, a lot of historical context, 3D buildings and landforms, which is, back some time ago, that might have been a hard thing. But if you go to the property information portal now on the DOS, the Department of Finance website, there are 3D visualizations of lot spaces. So aerial rights and subterranean rights can be visualized now in 3D. So this is not something that the technology can't do. It's just about enabling the data and building the app to be able to display 3D. People asked about those tax lot photos that are part of the Department of Records. Hey, wouldn't it be neat to geo-reference those and get those into the map? There was a really impassioned plea for iCards, which was a data set that I wasn't familiar with. I had to do some research to find out. Apparently, it has to do with like older buildings in the 20s, and some kind of inspection card that was done at that time, almost like a Delaney card. Old Board of Ed people might know what a Delaney card was for attendance, but this would have been for building inspections back in the day. Street View, which is something that we'll be able to add soon, and the historical aerial imagery is something that they would like to have added. The ability to enhance features, including measuring tools and links to COOs, the ability to add pins and save addresses, which was capability that CityMap 1.0 had, and the ability to contact representatives. So lots of people are using this to find out who represents certain areas. We've got the officials who represent those areas, but maintaining the contact information there. We tend to put a link to another site that you would then be able to look up the contact information, because contact information for representatives changes a lot, right? And then a lot of historical research, right? So older Sanborn maps, historical spatial data, and landmarks. So these are all things, these are wonderful ideas that we'd like to add in the future, or we invite the community to advocate for and to perhaps build from the sources of Boca data that we have. since we deployed the app in January or released the app in January, we're still getting feedback, right? So on the page, there is a feedback form that people can fill in. Since January, we received over 100 comments. Again, super detailed stuff for people that are really passionate. Maybe these comments are a little saltier than the comments to the survey, to the responses to the survey, but still very focused and very helpful. OTI has been responding to each one of these comments, working really diligently to get back to everybody and supply them with the new information or the guidance that they need to make use of CityMap. And then these suggestions go into a backlog, and OTI developers are starting to learn how to support the app. So what we're hoping is soon, within the next couple of weeks, for example, there's all these layers that refer to the 2016 planimetric layers. These are detailed drawings of swimming pools and curb lines and boardwalks that are derived from the orthophotography. The 2022 versions are available. If you're a GIS person, they're available on Open Data already. But we'd like to add them to CityMap so that you can be able to visualize them there and replace the 26 layers with the 22 layers. And OTI developers are working on that today. So we're excited that that will be around soon. Great. I know I've been talking for a long time. You're probably sick of me hearing from me. So this is kind of the part where I get to the end where I ask you, if you want, to talk about where did you first learn about CityMap? Did you use CityMap? What were your impressions? Did your impressions change over the years as your needs changed or your abilities changed? And then I guess the question is, what should CityMap be? What's the role of a map for visualizing all of this data? Should it be in the Open Data download capability, right? Should that be the place to go visualize all the data in a bunch of different layers? Then how do one of the things that I come away with from seeing other presentations this week is that there's lots of really great data viewers, right? We saw Speed the other day at the GIS conference, right? Had data layers that I wasn't aware of and I didn't know. We often build map portals or mapping applications with lots of layers. But for the public, it's got to be hard to know which one has the information that you need, or what do you do when one fits upon some of your needs, but not all of your needs. So I guess I'm curious if people have thoughts about, how do we guide New York City residents and users to the right map to help them out? The presentation, if you're interested in, the presentation will be in my GitHub by today. I've got some links here that are helpful, and thanks for your time. We can answer questions or talk about things or whatever you would like. I haven't looked at the chat at all. So,
yeah, we definitely have a few comments and a few questions in the chat, Tim. And thank you for that exhaustive presentation on the long history of CityMap. The first one I'm seeing is from Dan, who had to leave to move his car, a very New York experience, about ArcIMS versus ArcGIS Server, if there are papers on this, and the migration of CityMap. And then he also mentioned that he's, as a longtime observer of Esri, also confused by the product names.
Yes. There's a lot of product names, and it's and I concur, it's very confusing. There is no paper, so I can include links in the helpful links section that were papers from the presentation in 2006 about the architecture of CityMap when it was in ArcIMS. As far as the transition, when it changed, to my knowledge, there's no documentation of that. So I can share what I have.
Then I see there's a question from Janu, if there's an API you build on top of, CityMap.
So there's no API in CityMap, but I did allude to an environment. So there are APIs that are available through Open Data, right? And much of Open Data has the same spatial data that all of the data that we're presenting in MapInfo or in CityMap is in Open Data. There is ArcGIS Online, and much of the spatial data is also already posted into ArcGIS Online. So lots of city agencies put data in ArcGIS Online for consumption through there, and those can be reached through an API. And then the third thing I'll say is that image that I showed that had all the things that we were working on for the project, there is a website or a web builder called ArcGIS Hub. And OTI hasn't released it to the public yet, but that will, when it is released, and we hope that it will be released sometime in the next year, that'll have access to the APIs that you can consume in applications as well. So there'll be a couple of different options there. The goal there is to really make sure that the GIS hub site that we create is synced up to open data so that all the data sets are synced between the two, and that there's never anything that's out of date, including metadata that's out of date between those two sources. We want them to be acquired. So a lot of work that has to be done.
Then, to definitely echo that comment of not add in clarity and not confusion when we release more data from official sources, so that way people can see the open data and GIS data as well. There's a question from Emily, who works at IBO at Casey from City Planning, I think BuildOn, asking if the layers on Citymap are the latest official data. And in other words, can this map be used as up-to-date data source in geospatial analyses, which I think you kind of already answered, Tim, but if you could expand on that.
Right. So in most cases, yeah. So for data, and gets a little bit complicated, right? There's a lag between updating some data sources versus others. Some of the data is derived from city planning, and we consume the REST endpoints that city planning produces. So it's as updated as often as city planning does. And each data set has a little bit different provenance or scheduling. So Map Pluto, for example, is released quarterly, but it's not always quarterly on exactly the same day, right? The goal was quarterly. CSCL, on the other hand, that's updated weekly, right? And then there are larger data sets, like I mentioned, the planimetric layer, where we try to include the date actually in the layer name, because that's only done every couple of years, right? It's challenging, and I think one of the things that we'd like to be able to improve with Citymap, right, is having the ability to follow the breadcrumbs to the metadata, so that you can see the qualities of the metadata that's on. I can say for the political districts, though, it is up to date for now. I know we just changed some of the city council districts recently, right? And so there were certainly comments, and we went back and made sure that those were up to date as of now. So.
And then Casey, I mentioned, added on to Emily's question, asking if metadata will be readily available download alongside the data export functionality.
Yeah, it's not on our roadmap. I think we need to figure out how to deliver that. This is part of the challenge so there's three kind of there's a number of challenges in there. One is how do we curate the metadata and the data together and keep them in sync? I think Open Data has created a capability for that. The Open Data team has created a capability for that didn't exist maybe when Citymap was launched back in 2006, right? But our technology stack, and particularly the app builders that we use, has to have some way to sort of facilitate that connection. And I think that's where we need to go back and figure out how to deliver that information through the app. Not quite sure how we're going to do that yet, but I really appreciate that feedback. It's important. It's an important part.
Looking through more questions, and feel free to raise your hand if you did not put your question in the chat and to come off mute. But I see a question from Alfred asking if there's any plan to incorporate DOT parking signage as one of the layers, because there was an event with a DOT team earlier this week.
It's not on our backlog right now, right? And DOT does amazing stuff in a lot of different ways. So I think the answer is it could, but it's not in our backlog right now.
And then, Janu, I see you raised your hand, but there's one more question that came in from Stephen. There's a question about who is maintaining the latest version of CityMap? Is it Esri? Is it OTI?
Yeah. So thanks for that question. It's a little confusing. So yeah, so it is OTI. It's OTI's environment. It's OTI's development team, GIS team. That is the front edge of maintaining it, and Esri supports OTI in maintaining it. So they have reachback support to us, and what we expect to do is be in an operations and maintenance contract with OTI for the long term, so that we can continue to support that. But it is OTI's environment.
And Janu, feel free to come off mute and ask a question.
There. Thank you for a presentation. Fascinating stuff. I think I had two questions. One is, I see, is there a separate office or something that does the MTA maps? How are they related? I see something in the chat about the MTA maps. And is that information, all the MTA information, also available on CityMap?
So right now, it's not. It could be. And part of the, so the MTA is not a city agency, right? It's a regional authority because it's bigger than just the city. We've been focusing in on OTI and a couple of other city agency data sets, but there's nothing that prevents, the city, MTA data, especially subway data or bus data, to be included into the map. It's just part of, it's just another item that goes into the backlog of, what do we do first? What do we do second? I think, it's an exciting addition that we would like to get to, but it is a kind of a separate thing for right now. And I think the other thing is that we've run into this challenge of, if we add everything to CityMap, how do we make sure that everything is updated in the best sort of way? Like, how do we support all of the different data layers that people can possibly imagine? Is that sustainable, right? And again, we think of the amazing effort that Open Data team puts together as a funded organization and office that does this day to day. Like, they eat this every day, right? And that's challenging enough. If you add on another application to that, it can be, it's how do you do the long range planning for the funding and support of that in the long term? I think is a bigger question that OTI will need to face in the long term.
One more question. Yeah. I think it's so much, there is a lot of information, I think, but what would be useful is, like Apple or something is done, is if you let developers build on top of that, or how do we do that? I think it just builds stuff on top of that, because there are a lot of people who I think would love to build stuff on top of this. So.
Right. So that a great point. And I think part of this is, the Esri development platform is open and available and free, right? So it's free to get started, and I can put some links in the page there. Again, I didn't want to do this presentation as about Esri and it was about CityMap, and then sure, there's lots of other options for how to do that stuff. So
yeah, I know we're over time, just to respect everyone's time. I know, Tim, you said you could stay for a little bit for more questions. But for anyone who has to go, I would remind you to check out the Open Data Week website, which is open-data.nyc, where you can find more events, including, Janu, to your point, how to build on top of New York City's publicly available data. So as Tim mentioned, a lot of the data sources that are on CityMap, and everything is either on or will be on New York City Open Data. And there are ways to build on that, using all sorts of tools. I guess the last question I see in the chat is from Bill C, who was asking about how many of you are working on the strategy and UX for CityMap.
Right. So for the UX, it was not a big team. One of our developers, Carrie Gathers, who's a was just kind of a whiz with the technology, built out most of it, had a configuration specialist who was assisting. So it was really two who were doing the building part. We did do a lot of UX and UI interface with OTI representatives. So the deputy director for applications and the person who was in charge of the design studio at the time gave us a ton of feedback about how they wanted the UX to work. And then once that round completed, then we did UAT testing with the GIS team, the data part of the GIS team in particular, did the actual UAT before release.
And it seems like you have significant, a really powerful engine, a really wide range of audiences and types of users with really different wants and needs. And that in some ways you could look at it as a UX strategy that you want to develop.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. And it's interesting. So in our project, our Esri user experience directors are a big part of the overall project. So some of the other applications that we produce follow the template that our UX team has implemented. So Vaccine Finder and Food Help and applications like that are much more single purpose, follow that design principle. But those designers, they don't often design these kinds of, again, kitchen sink apps or showcase apps. So they were a little nervous about how to get involved, and they had advocated doing the kinds of focus groups at the beginning of the project that we didn't really do. Again, schedule and budget and prioritization, we didn't do until the end of the project. Had we done it the way that I think we would have all loved to do it, we would have gotten that feedback first and used that as the input to our UX that would have informed the user experience in a way that would have really improved the app in a number of ways. So
sure, well, that's a common experience in UX development across industries, right? And one of the approaches is to think of things as an iteration, and you do what you can, and you cycle around and do it again.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder if it seems like you might be able to maybe leverage your various different departments and their different audiences in terms of having them sponsor some focus groups in their focused area.
Yeah.
It might be a strategy, but it sounds like a great, interesting challenge you're doing a lot of good work on.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks for the presentation. It's really interesting.
Thank you. Okay.
So thank you all again for attending, and thank you, Tim, for presenting.
Zachary, thanks for everything. Appreciate it.